No, I am not. Okay. All right, so some improvements that can be done to scientific practice at large. We can utilize a larger sample size that usually yields more even results and more generalizable results. It's important to report all analyses and variables. This is why I'm pushing also for you guys to even talk about unexpected results, is if those findings are just not discussed and the next research comes out and goes, oh, well, this wasn't significant.
How long is she?
Knowing that ahead of time would have been
How long is
helpful.
she, like, how much longer are we going to be in class?
I think somebody maybe is not muted and talking in the background. Is that possible?
Yeah, I hear that.
I
I
can't
think somebody's
figure out
not muted.
here. I think it might have been Grace by accident. Okay. So making sure that you report all findings is going to be important in order to better understand what's going on. The open science collaboration, that's the group that we talked about just a minute ago. It's the practice of sharing one's data and materials freely so that others can collaborate, use, and verify the results. It is still very frustrating to me when some of my dissertation students want to do a replication study and they'll reach out to original authors and those authors will say, no, I'm not sharing anything. I'm not going to share my data with you. I'm not going to share the survey with you. It's just really not in the spirit of being open-minded and transparent about what studies are all about. And then a pre-registration idea. So the scientists can pre-register their studies methods, hypotheses, no, everybody's in, statistical analyses, and all of that in advance of data collection. So you write it all down so that as a researcher, you know you did it in the correct steps, right? So if it's pre-registered, and usually the way that would work is you would get IRB approval if you're working for a large institution. And so that would need to be shown ahead of time prior to the collection of data, which would give greater validity than that you did not manipulate the data on the other end. Okay, meta-analyses. That is, again, the gathering of all previous literature that is related to at least one of the constructs that you are interested in, okay? There are several examples that you can think of. I was bringing up earlier, cognitive behavioral therapy and depressive symptoms as just one example, but there are many others as well. So the scientific literature, again, is a series of related studies conducted by different researchers who have tested similar variables, okay? So the idea of doing a meta-analysis is a statistical analysis that will yield a quantitative summary of the scientific literature. So these are just some example. What's the relationship between religiosity and depression? What's the relationship between violent video games and behavior? And what are some of the strengths and, again, limitation of each study? So if you put them all side by side, you're better able to compare each study as to their unique strengths and weaknesses, so you can speak more eloquently on the constructs at large and how to run a future study, okay? So that ends up being quite beneficial as well. Okay, so in this particular example, we're using Cohen's guideline for effect size. This is back to your statistics class, which may be far back in your mind. You're like, we have, really repressed that trauma. So Cohen's guidelines are for small, medium, and large effect size. So a group of researchers conducted a meta-analysis to examine, again, the relationship between religiosity and depression. This is a quick reminder, again, hopefully you guys can see my cursor. The effect size D, right? If it's 0.2 around there, that's a smaller, weak relationship. 0.5 is a medium or moderate effect size. 0.8 is a larger, strong effect size. So if you look over here, this is, again, R, that is our correlation coefficient. And that kind of lines up again with the strength of the relationship, okay? So by looking at all of those studies, and there were 147 studies that they looked at, they found that the average correlation between religiosity and depression was negative 0.09. Okay, so that shows us that as religiosity goes up, depressive symptoms decline. But, and there's a big but here, is this a strong correlation?
.09.
Yes.
No.
So the effect size is small, okay? So according to Cohen's benchmark, that is a small, effect size. So again, if you think about what is contributing to depressive symptoms, being religious is not a large, it doesn't have a large effect size on depressive symptoms, okay? Does that kind of make sense? All right.
Yeah. Also, it is kind of interesting because like I have heard that like stigma or whatever, like, oh yeah, I was sad and then I found God. Now I'm, the happiest, person ever.
Yeah. Well, and I think spirituality, religiosity often acts as significant coping skills, right? So it's a new way, oftentimes it could be a new lens through which to look at the world, a new form of support, either through a community, through a pastor, through the Bible, or even just, Bible study on your own. So there's multiple aspects that can be beneficial as well. All right, so this is another example of a meta-analysis, okay? So they're looking at violent video games and behavior, and you can see the type of outcome here: aggressive behavior, pro-social behavior, and empathy for others' suffering. These are the number of studies that were measured that actually looked at this specific outcome right here, the total number of participants in each of the studies, and the average effect size, or R, meaning a positive value means violent video games group scored higher on those, okay? So what do we see? What do we know?
Oh, very little, very little.
Okay.
Because, well, 0.1, yeah, it's somewhat, but it's definitely not like a significant indication of violence or aggressive behavior.
Or in terms of the effect size, like we were talking about, the Cohen's effect size. But some are positive, the other two are negative. So what does that mean? So those who participate or who like engaged in video games showed higher, right? There's the more video games you played, the more aggressive behavior you showed. Okay. That's a positive relationship. The negative relationship means the more video games you play, the less pro-social behavior you show and the less empathy for others' suffering you show. Okay. Again, we're not looking at very strong effect size. They're small to medium, according to this. And then you can look here, the next table is a follow-up meta-analysis where they grouped the studies by methodological quality. They were either weak or strong. So again, the study's quality was moderated, or it moderated the effects between violent video games and behaviors, and that methodologically stronger studies show a larger effect size than those of the weaker study. You see that right here. So that effect size is larger than this one. So the stronger studies methodologically have a greater impact, which I suppose is a good thing. All right, so let's talk about strengths and weaknesses of meta-analysis. Strength, we can get closer and closer to the truth. So obviously in one particular study, maybe you end up with, 300 participants and they complete your survey. In a meta-analysis, you can look at 10, 15, 30 studies, and now all of a sudden you've got thousands and thousands of participants, right? So you can get closer and closer to this idea of truth or fact because you have more people that are participating in it. The major downside is this file drawer problem. So it may overestimate the true effect size because null effects or opposite effects haven't been included in the analysis. They're really just looking at the behavior or the measure that their alternate hypothesis is measuring. So for instance, the effectiveness of antidepressant medication on depressive symptoms. Of 74 studies that were analyzed, 38 showed positive results, 24 negative, and 12 showed questionable results. All but one of the studies with positive results had been published in medical journals, whereas null findings were less likely to be published. This is again showing, do you guys remember that TED Talk by Goldacre that talked about that specific graph, right? Where you only show positive findings, everything else is just buried. It's not actually published. That's problematic, right? Null findings are never published, are less likely to be published. Only 3 of the 36 negatives or questionable outcomes were published. And if you only examine published studies, then 94% showed that antidepressants are effective, right? Which is not necessarily the truth. So this is something else that we need to be mindful of. Published effects can be exaggerated because they're not really representative of all studies that have taken place. But again, the rules of publication is they want something new and shiny, something that shows, effectiveness and statistically significant results. So then we end up with kind of a bias base for our findings. All right. Replicability in the popular press. So journalists do not always consider the importance of replicability. When you hear about a specific, finding on the news, they've not said, and this finding has been replicated by 4 other studies, therefore we feel confident this is actually happening, and that's why we are telling you, right? So they're not always reporting on the most exciting studies, but they also summarize the body of literature on the topic. That's what they should be doing. They should be showing you all of the studies, the exciting and the old, a mixture of it, but that doesn't always tend to happen, especially in popular press. It tends to be more of almost a, what is that called? A bait and click or bait and, like you just
Clickbait.
click and bait. That's what it is. Yeah. All right. So to be important, does a study have to have external validity? Right? We need to know about that. So replicability is one way, but we also need to look at the external validity. So does it generalize to other participants, right? Or is it just idiosyncratic to the original research? Does it generalize to other settings? Remember the example we talked about earlier with college admissions? Well, that may be an interesting thing to look at, but if you're going to switch countries and their educational setting is completely different, do you want it to generalize? Like, does your original research question actually now make sense with this new population? Next, does a study have to be generalizable to many people, or are we okay with having a smaller sector of people that it can generalize to? I would say if you do a study and it's for women, are we okay excluding any non-woman? That might be okay. But if we're looking at, again, we make the funnel smaller, then we're really looking at small N studies and more like almost case study at that point. And then does a study have to take place in a real world setting? So these are all the things we're going to be looking at because that's pretty huge. There are some behaviors that you can measure and observe in a laboratory setting, but then the question is, so what? Like, how does that link to the real world? Because obviously that would be the generalizable piece to it. Okay. So generalizing to other participants. Now, in order to evaluate a study's ability to, again, generalize, you need to find out how participants were obtained. That's the first thing. How were they recruited? And usually you identify a population and you sample that population, right? But it is a population, not the population. It's not everybody in the United States was, available to be gathered and sample. It's usually something smaller. So for you guys, you were looking at a population, the population of Aquinas. It's not all college students in the United States, right? So because of that, because it is a sample or a population, I should say, we need to make sure that it could generalize to other samples or other, the rest of the population at large. So again, external validity comes from how a sample is obtained, not necessarily how many. If I'm interested again in people's views on politics, right? And I place myself on a college campus at a coffee shop, and that's how I'm sampling. And then I'm saying all of West Michigan thinks X or Y. What might be the problem here?
Tiny sample size.
Well, not only in number, right? Right. It's not just even because I could wait there at that coffee shop for 2 weeks and collect 1,000 people. So it's not necessarily a number, but
yeah, like small demographic of people too.
Right. Like I've just recruited from such a small pool. It's not a diverse pool. It's a sampling of convenience, anybody who would come to that coffee shop, right? And how can I say that that is representative of all of West Michigan, right? That's kind of problematic thinking, okay? And just because a sample comes from a population, does it mean that it even generalizes to that population? And that was very clear. So there's a group in my other section that only, and they were interested in athletes, right? So let's start with that. So they only asked college athletes to complete the study. Well, their response may not be what every Aquinas student would say, right? Because they looked at a subsector. So even if you're within one population, if you make it even smaller, again, that may not even generalize. So you got to be thoughtful on how you're doing it. Next, does it actually generalize to other settings? So this is what's considered ecological validity. It's an aspect of external validity where the focus is whether a laboratory study can actually generalize to a real world setting, okay? So one example of that is solving story problems in a lab the same as solving similar problems in the real world, right? Is there a change that comes about by being in a real world environment versus a lab that would make a difference, right? So this would push us to measure it in a real world setting rather than a laboratory. But again, what are some pitfalls of observing behavior in the real world?
There are so many factors that you really can't account for. Like,
Right.
yeah. There just are so many external things that it's just like, eh. But in a laboratory setting, you can, like, hey, we can control a lot of the external stuff. We can't really control like emotions, but we can affect, like, you're not gonna be annoyed by the sunlight.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely correct. It is all an issue of control. In a lab setting, the participant, the researcher, the principal researcher, controls almost every single aspect of the environment, right? They can choose to make you cold or make you hot or make you annoyed with noise or take the noise away or introduce distractors or minimize distractors. The real world does not work this way at all, right? Do you guys know all that famous, this was done probably in the 70s, maybe even earlier than that, the elevator experiment?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
So it's a social experiment so when you walk into an elevator, right? Doors are in front of you, they open. What do?
We look at the doors. No eye contact to other people in there.
No, okay, so I wasn't precise enough. So you stand up, okay? So the doors are right here, right? They're right in front of you. They open. You walk in. What do you do next?
Oh, you turn around.
You turn around, right? Go like this. Why is that? Why do we do that?
Because that's how we're gonna leave.
That's why what?
That's where the doors open and we leave out the same door that we came in.
Right. It is this thing that we all do, right? Now, if you pause and think about it, you're kind of like, huh, where did I learn to do that?
From my parents.
Right? It's just social modeling, right? So we walk in, this is the behavior we do. If you think about it, it's a little weird. Why couldn't we just turn around before we leave? Right? But this is what we do. So in this experiment, right, it was in a laboratory. They had people in the elevator already, the doors open, the dude, participant, right, steps in, but now everybody is looking the opposite way. So they didn't come in and turn around. They're all facing the back. So what does this dude do?
Ooh, conforms to societal pressure.
He conforms. He goes, and you could see that he's like, but he conforms, right? Because it feels weird to be the only person who's doing this thing, even though it's the thing you've always done. Something goes through your mind. Now, have you guys ever stepped in an elevator like that where people are facing the other way?
No.
No one?
Not unless it opens both sides.
Yes. So that's what I was thinking. So that has happened to me where I walk in, I'm like, everyone is staring the other way. What are they doing? Am I in a study? Is there a hidden camera? But no, sure enough, it's because there's a door on the other side. So I'm walking in this way, but the next level, up or down that we go, we have to go out that way. This is especially common in New York. If you're taking elevators in and out of the subway, usually you go in one way, go out the other. So anyway, where was I going with this? Oh, so this particular experiment had to be done in a laboratory. Why is that?
Well, it was because they needed the people already in the elevator looking towards the other direction, and they couldn't account for other people getting on in the real world.
Exactly, right? So you need to control the fact that the Confederates, the other people that were on the elevator who are kind of part of the study too, not as participant, but they're like, they know what's going on, right? Like they're being paid or asked to behave in a certain way. They need to be in on it, so it can't be randos. And then you don't want anybody else coming in and going, why are we standing this way? Or like muddying up your data. You're just looking for straight social conformity from one individual. So there are certainly times where doing things in a laboratory makes the most sense. But the question becomes, how do we then bring it back to the real world? Because that's what we want to know about. We want to know if the concept, the construct of social conformity actually happens in the real world, right? So what other ways could we test that out?
I do know that there was like one test, and it's like, 3 lengths of like a line,
Mhm.
and it's like, okay, so like everyone say it's B.
Line
when
B,
cle-
right.
Yeah, and it's like, well, I said it was B, so everyone did, and then it's like, oh shoot, it's clearly A is the longer one, but everyone else said it, so B.
Right. But in the real world, do you ever see people conform to social behavior and you're like, why are we doing this? Why did I conform?
There's probably so many examples.
So have you ever stood in a line, right? Where, especially now, right, with COVID, where everybody's supposed to social distance. I just recently had that when I got my first shot of the vaccine. There was a long line going in, right? I took it out in Greenville. And I looked and I was like, the stickers go this way to make like a Disneyland line the other way. But people had started to line up in a totally different way. And I'm sure several people were like, I think we're supposed to go that way. That's obviously the direction. But these two people at the front, at the line, they didn't do that. So now we're all going to conform and follow this line the wrong way, even though most of us probably realize we're going the wrong way. But because the people at the front were like, well, I guess this is what we're doing. Until the nurse came back and, guys, you see there's a flow. And then, no joke, 14 of us had to reorganize. totally conformed. I had noticed it and I was like, well, I'm like person 7. What can I do? You just conform. Okay. So, oh my goodness. Cat. The cat is now on the mantle, in case you guys are curious. There she is, being annoying.
Got a perch.
Yeah, meowing away and trying to destroy everything. She just knocked 3 things off of there. Silly girl. So that's social conformity. So again, this does happen in the real world. Now, I think if someone was like, oh, I want to do a research study on social conformity, but I'll test it out in a laboratory. Yeah, you might want to, but this is a construct that's been tested and tested and tested and tested and seen to be true even in the real world. So you'd have to figure out what's the pros and cons of doing another study on a topic that's been so validated. Okay. Does this study have to be generalizable to many people? This is another question. So there's multiple ways that you can go about it. Okay. So there's the theory testing mode, generalizable mode. So again, it depends what it is you're trying to do. If you're trying to figure out if a theory actually exists, you probably want it to be generalizable to a lot of people, right? You want that to be shown to be valid for a large group of individuals. Similarly, if your goal is to say like, hey, this happens to everyone, obviously you need to have it be generalizable. All right. Cultural psychology specifically can fall under the special case of generalization. And the reason for that is if you're looking at a specific cultural group, it may not generalize to all cultural groups, right? You're taking kind of a smaller subsector of humanity to better understand them, but you still want it to be generalizable within that cultural group. Okay. We often in the world of social sciences test theories based on this weird participant. What weird stands for is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic participants, okay? Most often that's college students, right? They're of Western descent, that's your W. They're educated, they're in an industrialized country, they are wealthier than most, and part of a democratic country usually, or sometimes their views will be more liberal than maybe a general participant or general Joe Schmo in the population. Okay, so a few for theory testing mode. The contact comfort theory. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard about this particular study, the Harlow study. Is that, okay, let me just read you a little bit. I'm sure it'll ring a bell. So in that study, it was done in 1958. They were looking at attachment of infant monkeys. So they were designed to test whether the data supported the cupboard theory, babies are attached to moms because they feed them, or the contact comfort theory, babies are attached to moms because they nurture them and are soft and cozy. So the study had 2 moms, a cloth mom that provided comfort but no food, and a wire mom that provided food but no comfort. The baby monkeys in the study spent almost all of their time with cloth mom, which supports the contact comfort theory. So again, we have this theory, we test it out, okay? Another one is the parent as grammar coach theory. So it's an example of, again, you're testing the theory. This is what we're doing here, which is we're trying to figure out how do children learn grammar just more broadly. So the reinforcement theory of grammar states that children learn correct grammar through reinforcement. So they're given a cookie, told good job, some form of reinforcement. In the 1970s, Brown and Hanlon tested this theory by listening to audio tapes of parents and children interacting. They found that most of the time, parents corrected children's speech for factual accuracy, right? If a kid says mom is a boy, you go, no, mom is a girl, right? You're correcting for accuracy, which does not support the reinforcement theory of grammar. The participants in the study were upper middle class Boston families who are not representative of all kids in the United States. Obviously, you're picking one domain and they're wealthy upper middle class again. The biased sample wasn't important because they were just testing a theory. So that was the theory they were looking at. They weren't interested in as much in the external validity, meaning are all kids going to be like that? It was mostly the theory that the way grammar is taught is through reinforcement. And so because of that, this still works. Okay. Again, does the theory apply to the population? That's when we need to go further into a generalizable mode. So if we found that, yes, the theory is true, next we want to know who is it true for? Again, bias samples are not necessarily important when you're just testing the theory. At that point, internal validity is more important than external validity. But in order for the findings of the study to be meaningful and important, we do need to take it into generalization mode. Again, the primary concern here is external validity. How well does it generalize to others? You can make frequency claims in the generalization mode. So again, how many US teenagers text while driving? How many Americans smoke cigarettes? So you take, you look at the frequency within that. And sometimes you can make some association and causal claims, especially if you're trying to figure out like effectiveness or efficacy of treatment. I feel like then that's really where you want to go. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. Okay, so cultural psychology, that's kind of a special or unique piece of it. So in cultural psychology, again, it's a subdiscipline specifically of psychology that looks at how cultural contexts shape human thinking, feeling, and behavior. Most cultural psychologists tend to emphasize the generalization mode, and they've challenged researchers who operate exclusively in the theory testing mode. So again, you might be familiar. Does this look familiar to you? Have you guys seen this? The Mueller-Lyer illusion?
Think so.
Okay, so which
Yes,
line?
yes. Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah. Which line, A or B, is longer?
They're both the
They're
same.
the same.
You're like, stop testing us. They're
No,
the same.
I know that they're the same, but I still can't see it. B is longer to me.
Okay,
every-
anybody else feel like Kyle?
I'm like trying to move my mouse over it, and it actually looks like B is longer.
You're like,
Thank
you lie. No, they're completely identical.
No.
They are though.
I just don't. It is so. It is B to me,
Okay.
but I know that it's not.
All right, but this is actually, there's a cultural psychology behind that. Okay, so does the vertical line B appear longer? Some of you are like, yes, but of course it's like you're being tricked by your brain or by your eyes. You're like, but intellectually, they're identical, right? So the lines are the same lengths, but North Americans and Europeans tend to say that line B is longer than line A. If you look at these are the cross-cultural results right here that display how people around the world see the line. So specifically, many of the people around the world do not see line B as being longer than line A. If researchers from North America were working in a theory testing mode, then they would probably use a North American sample since generalizability is not a priority. But in this additional study, they were operating in generalization mode in their cross-cultural study with participants from around the world. They were trying to find that people who grow up in a carpentered world have more experiences with right angles as cues for depth perception than those in other societies. And because of that, that's what caused the difference in view, okay? So this is showing again the degree of the illusion. Here we've got the United States, Europe here. Sorry, I don't know why I couldn't read that. And then different countries. Again, we'd have to go back to these particular countries that are laid out because these regions are not all familiar to me. But you see that culture plays a role here as to whether they believe that line B is longer than line A. or view it. Maybe believe is not the right word. Okay, I want you to look at the picture and think about what you notice, okay? Okay, what did you notice?
There were,
5 fish.
Okay, anybody else?
say 5.
Yeah.
I thought 4. I saw
I
4.
saw 3 fish.
Weird. Okay.
There was 2 in the background. The littler ones farther
I
away.
saw 1 in the background. Also, the bigger 3 were all facing the same direction.
Okay, anything else that we noticed?
They were all underwater.
There were like 3 plants.
Okay, who is answering right now? I'm trying to figure out.
That's me, Mary Pat.
Hey, Mary Pat. Okay. All right, so let's look at it again. Okay. So definitely 3 fish, right? But there's another one here, another one here. There's a frog, there's a snail, there's plants, there's rocks. Okay. So this is the figure and ground concept. Most North Americans tend to see the figure prior to seeing the ground. So they'll see, most people notice just 3 fish. Okay. That's what they see. There's 3 fish. They're not paying attention as much to the ground or the smaller piece, right? So with the original background, with no background, and with a new background, right? So you can see the items that are shown. But again, when they showed the same image to Japanese college students, more of them tended to comment on the background or the ground first and the figure later, okay? So later on, participants were quizzed on what they had seen. Sometimes participants were shown one of the original fish with the same original background, no background, or with a new background to test whether they recognized the fish or the item shown. So again, it's a cultural piece that we tend to see what sticks out first, which maybe has something to do more broadly, right? Like being more individualistic rather than other cultures that are more collectivistic, where they see the background, the backdrop, the whole, rather than individuals. So another interesting finding. So when you think about generalizability, you have to take into account culture is going to play a big part of that.
I think it is really funny that no one mentioned the frog or the snail.
Or the snail. But Mary
Snail
Pat
was
was
like a
on it.
rock.
She's like, there's plants, there's five fish, it's in the water. You're on it, Mary Pat.
Good job, y'all.
All right. So that's showing the results. Again, percent accuracy at identifying the 3 fish that I just showed right here at the bottom, if they had their original background, no background, or new background. So those of the Japanese college students versus the North American students, you see they were far more accurate at identifying the original background picture, right? No background, Americans were a lot better, which kind of makes sense, right? Because if they're focused on the figure and you take away the background, they can identify that pretty clearly, even better than their Japanese counterparts. And then again, the novel background, both were worse, but somehow North American were better, again, at identifying the figure. But since they had focused so much on the background, that's why they were so much more accurate with it. Okay. This is the last piece we were talking about. So most research in psychology, and I would say social sciences at large, are done on North American college students. And specifically, the top 6 journals in psychology, this was a figure that was from 2007, 68% of the participants were American and 96% were from North America, Europe, Australia, or Israel. Participants from these countries are very different than participants in the rest of the world, and they've been referred to as this weird, right? Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Again, that presents a problem if you're trying to do, any sort of cultural focused study, because your participants are going to be majorly from one pool of participants. Okay. Now, does a study have to take place in a real world setting? Okay. Oftentimes people assume that studies are more important if they have taken place in a lab setting, but that may not be the case. Again, it's not always that way. There is external validity in the real world, obviously, tends to be a little bit more generalizable. And you can test things out in the real world. We'll go through each of those here. So when a study takes place in the real world, it occurs in a field setting and has high external validity, okay? That's, I mean, when it's called the field, it makes it sound like, ooh, fancy, but it's just, that's the real world, right? Lab research can be just as realistic as actual research conducted in the real world, which is known as experimental realism. So again, the elevator example I was telling you guys, that very much felt like a real event, right? You're not in a white room with a two-way mirror like what you would traditionally think as a lab experiment. It's literally just a dude walking into an elevator. Okay, but it is so controlled and part of that pseudo lab environment that's why it would be considered experimental realism. Okay. The generalization mode and the real world. So again, external validity is really important when you're in generalization mode. So having a representative sample is the most important part. Ecological validity is also important to consider, especially in non-laboratory settings. So you want to make sure that the findings will externalize to the real world. Okay. And then lastly, theory testing mode. When you're in that mode where you're looking at a specific theory, external validity and real world applicability are not as important because you're just looking at whether a theory holds true, okay? So this is actually in your textbook. And again, you can say like the latest, if you see this latest scientific breakthrough, right? This is what you want to know, right? Was it replicated? If it's a single study, how does it fit with the entire literature? How well did the methods of the study get at the theory they were testing? Was it conducted in a generalization mode? Were participants sampled randomly? Oh, the study had thousands of participants, but were they selected in such a way that allowed generalization to the population of interest? Would the results hold up in another cultural context? And would that result apply in other settings? These are all things that you want to know when you're looking at a latest scientific breakthrough, okay? That you don't want to say these things here, okay? That psychological principle seems so basic. I'm sure it's universal, right? No, we're not. We never say I'm sure. We never assume. We never do any of those things. So yeah, that would be not good. Whoops. All right. That's it. That is chapter 14. It's the last chapter of our class. Questions, comments, concerns about this chapter. Did it all make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
This
So
is a good one to end on. This is fun.
I know it's tying the bow on everything else we've talked about. So, all right. So next week, Wednesday is your exam. It'll go live early in the morning. Make sure to take it. Kind of important. My cell phone number is going to be on the first page. If you have questions as you're taking it, please do shoot me a text. Be mindful if you ask me what's the answer to number 3, I'm going to go har har. Thank you for the laugh. If you have a specific question like, hey, what do you mean here? I'm not like the kind of questions you would ask me in a classroom environment. Please, obviously, that's why my number's there. So do reach out. Otherwise, by end of day, by midnight, you will need to submit your final papers. And that's it.
So, sorry, I think I wrote down something different. So on the 28th of next week, which is that Wednesday, the exam is due at midnight, and then the final paper is due on the 30th?
Yes. Did I
Okay.
say Wednesday?
Yes.
I misspoke. Thank you,
That's
Elizabeth.
okay.
Yep. No, you're correct. So Wednesday exam. By Friday the 30th, final paper.
Okay.
And then
Yes.
nothing is due tonight, correct?
Nothing is due tonight. I changed my mind, giving you guys extra time. We'll just turn it in as a whole document, not just one section.
I'm gonna be honest. That's the first like good news I've heard about like due dates in like a couple weeks.
I have 7 papers due by the end of the semester.
I get it. I get it. I'm right there with you. I'm at
Yeah.
like 4 now, but like, geez, 7. God.
I
And
had
it's not-
9 and finished 2 this week already. So
Well, congrats.
A lot.
Keep-
Are you in your capstone, McKenna?
no, just I don't know. Just all my classes decided papers are due at once. So
Boy, I'm sorry.
I'm almost done. It's fine.
Just-
Okay.
I feel like these are the moments at the end of the semester. You're like, you know, have you guys ever swam underwater and you're like, I'm running out of breath, the end of the pool better come soon. Like we're right at that spot where it's like you're feeling that, but you also know you're almost done.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, it was great getting to work with all of you this semester. Please reach out if you have any questions in the future. And best of luck on the exam and the final paper.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All
much.
right. Bye, guys.
Thanks for a great semester.
Thank you. Bye.